Hi, Kath Herbert's asked me to put together a small presentation to show you or to talk about the strategies and the approach that I use for preparation and also talk about how we use Mulligans. So this is my strategy for the session. I'll start with subject basics. I'll look at the essentials that a student must know and what do they need to demonstrate that knowledge. And I like to start there. I like to review that so I'm aware of precisely what I'm going on. Then I'll look at the content and the supporting material, and because I'm teaching IT subjects, I know the content's going to change fairly rapidly in some cases. In the cloud computing subjects, it's constantly changing. So I need to check, is it current, is it appropriate, are there any new or better or perhaps different supporting materials, because there's always a range of new things coming out that may be better than the materials we're using at the moment. So have a look at those. My next step then is to try and find a case study, and a case study, a good realistic case study, is what I like to use to support this content and to base all the assignments and assessments on. And at this stage, if I can find something that looks to be fairly reasonable, I'll start using that, and I'll start to rough out the assessment timings. And that gives me a rough idea then of how much work I can expect the students to do, but also how much work I've got to mark. So with my case study problem, once I've selected a problem, I will build or rewrite it to meet the assessment aims. I will think about what are the questions I've got to ask the students in order to meet those aims, and then what would the perfect response to each question look like? And that frankly becomes the HD rubric. So that's where I'll start. I'll get that done, and then I'll get into each question and I'll write the question and make sure it's aligned with the aims. And then having written that question, I'll say, now how do I mark this? What are the things I look for? What marks do I give to each part, etc.? Is the HD rubric for this question appropriate? Do I modify it? Get that right. So I go through each of those questions. I'll check the assessment schedule once I've finished to make sure that it all looks like it's going to hang together fairly well. And then I'll take each of those HD rubrics I've written and downgrade them so I can get the distinctions, credits, pass and fail grades. And you've got the rubric and then suddenly sorted out along with your marking criteria. And that means if you're passing it on to other lecturers to also teach, this suddenly becomes a lot easier for them. They've got the basis of not only the assessment, they know how they're going to mark it. So here's an example I'm using from this year's ITC 561. This is in the 1730 session. So we have a case study for Soft Arc Engineering, a civil engineering company. They're contemplating a move into the cloud in order to save some time and cost and money on their computer infrastructure, and they're engaged as a consultant. And so the first part of this is pretty well a consultancy job for the students, and they need to prepare a briefing for the engineering board. And so their briefing's got to explain the concepts, explain some of the architectures that would be useful, and they should have briefing notes, speaking notes, etc. in each of the notes sections. So that starts them off. That's only the first question. There's a number of others. But that then allows me to keep putting the stuff we talk about in the content into the context of this problem, which then works right through all their assignments. They're all based around this case study. So that's the way I approach this. I think it's a fairly good move. It may or may not be suitable for your subject. I also use Mulligans, and I use Mulligans as an engagement strategy. And this is something that came up from an article I saw by Lisa Pavia-Eagle a couple of years ago in Faculty Focus, and she was using Mulligans in a high school situation in order to try and get engagement going and give people a chance. And I looked at that and I thought, this could be kind of interesting. ITC 114, database management at that stage, was suffering with engagement issues, and particularly in the face-to-face classes, people just weren't engaged. They weren't getting any sort of real interaction with the subject. And so what I did was I started that in this session, the 2014-60 session in the Bathurst internal class. And so what I did was I had some Mulligan cards printed. I started asking questions and I gave out Mulligans for good or inventive answers. And I said, you can swap mulligans for marks in your assignment, up to a maximum of 5 per assignment. So suddenly we got some interest happening. Suddenly there was a huge amount of engagement and an incredible increase in competitiveness, which we'll talk about later. However, be aware of the needs of the less competitive students, because it actually made some of the quieter students even quieter. So I had to start thinking about how do we approach that. So this is the thing that was I'd put up on the first lecture. These next two slides are basically the introduction. A mulligan's a card you get for good answers, well thought out points you raise in discussions, picking up on an error but also saying how you'll solve it, demonstrating you've mastered a concept, demonstrating improvement in a specific area, and now it includes correctly answering online lecture quizzes. We'll talk about that shortly as well. Mulligan questions can be asked at any time, but not every question is going to be a mulligan. And I get them, if I give them a card, get them to write their name on the sheet before they leave. That way I can keep a record of who's got mulligans. So it's a fairly straightforward approach. This is the second page of this introduction. A mulligan's worth 1 mark. Up to 5 mulligans can be applied to an assignment. So if you're you're not terribly confident in a particular assignment, you can apply some mulligans you've earned in the class to sort of take up some of the slack. And so what you do is you say that you want to use some mulligans, the assignment gets assessed as normal, and then I'll add your mulligan points on top of your final mark. Note the caveats here, you can't get 105 out of 100, nor can you use them in the exam. So it's assignment stuff only. So this is kind of interesting, and this really started to increase the competitiveness. But where it really started to work was when I started to do online quizzes. And again, I found an app called Socrative, which enables you to run an online interactive quiz at any time during the lecture. So the students can access that quiz through their laptop, their tablet, their phone. However, you as the lecturer need a separate device, because you can't really run Socrative on the same machine that you're running your lecture slides, which has been captured by CSU Replay, because it's going to be visible to the students. So you're going to need a phone or an iPad or a tablet of something. So the first trial ran in the 2015-60 class, again in ITC 114, Bathurst Internal, and we were getting participation rates for 2 quizzes in the class of approximately 90%. So I awarded mulligans for the results, but I needed to just make sure I set the criteria first. It was a bit embarrassing the first time because we kind of ran it to see what would happen, and it was a little bit disorganised the second time round. The criteria are in place, and then it suddenly became much more interesting and much more structured. This also works really well with DE cohorts, because I ran it then with a DE cohort that I was teaching for ITC 114, and it was just as competitive, just as interesting, as just that now I've got to write them down when I give them out. Okay, but it works. So once you've got it recorded, you know you can check against your list and see what happens. So this is the quick quiz that comes up in the lecture. It gives you the login address, or the address to go to, log in using your name, and I put a thing there, no name, no mulligan. You know, it's great having user 123 in there, but anybody can claim to be user 123. So you've got to use your name. Open the data quiz, it gives you a number so that you've got the thing, complete the quiz, and in this case the first 3 students to correctly answer the 3 questions scored a mulligan. So this is what the quiz looked like. This is looking at it at the lecturer's side. So, this is the quiz being prepared. So this is a multiple choice quiz. Data is comprised of processed information, numbers only, text only, or raw facts. And as you see, I've got answer D highlighted as the correct answer. So I can save that. I can also align these to a standard if I need to. And so what I would normally do is I would set up a quiz of between 5 and 8 questions. Because remember, the lecture stops when this is on. But sort of about 20 minutes into the lecture, into a 2-hour lecture, to suddenly jerk everybody up. Okay, we're going to run a quiz, bang, and then maybe at about the 1 hour stage, or just before that, hit them with a second one, and then possibly even a third one towards the end. But you need to space them out a little bit. That's my experience anyway. I also moved to the slow quiz. And the slow quiz was where I used to ask the more complex questions that you're not going to get really in the multiple choice questionnaire format. So because this can't be automatically marked, and of course the normal MCQ questions are, so they get their answers immediately. What I was doing with this was running this as an end of class quiz. And so now when the class returned the next session, we would say, okay, now the following people earn mulligans from their slow quiz. So really good answers, really thoughtful stuff. They've got, in my case, a week to do it between two lectures. But a much lower participation rate, somewhere about 20 to 25%. I think 20% is probably closer to that. The interesting point was there's far more engagement from the more reserved students. These were the guys who were pushed a little bit and were not quite so competitive in the normal class and with the normal quiz. They will take their time and give you some good detailed answers. So this is the sort of format, and this is from ITC 204, the Human Computer Interface lecture. And so, what is a mental model? How do users use mental models? What are the design implications for you of a user's mental model? So, and as I said to the class, what I want is a small paragraph, a couple of sentences that describes what it is. And that gives them a pretty good idea. And then I mark it. Once I mark it, the results go back, they can log in, they get their results, and there it is. So it's a very, very effective way of doing it. Bear in mind, though, that one of the things I found that not every student brings a device to class. So the first time I expected everybody would have a device. That's what we're told. All the students are all completely digitally attached. It's not the case. There's anything up to around about 10% of students don't have a device in class. So the first time I went in expecting completely 100% attendance or participation, but without devices, you've then got to start to print off the quizzes, which means you now have an alternative. So anybody who hasn't got a device, perfect. Here's a paper copy. Fill it out. Right? And that means they can then still be involved in it, even though they haven't bought a device or don't have a device with them. So to quickly wrap it up, engagement requires, from the way I see it, 4 things. What's going to engage the students, and will the reward work? And that's effectively what we're doing here, rewarding students for being engaged. How will you engage the students? And what I found with the Mulligans and the online quizzes, it actually gets competitiveness going, and it starts to get people thinking and fighting and competing against each other. When will you do it? That's kind of critical, and that'll depend on your lecture and your particular teaching style and how you're going to do it. As I said, I try to do 3 and a 2-hour lecture, about 20 minutes in, just prior to or just on the hour, and then around about 20 minutes to go. And perhaps I might throw in a slow quiz at the end, but if I have a slow quiz, I'll normally cut out one of the others. So, excuse me, but what it really requires more than anything is for you to be a bit innovative in the way in which you apply your thoughts here. How can I do this? What will work for me? How can I get my students involved and engaged if I use something like this? So when Kath and I were talking over this and writing up our notes and preparing, for the inevitable paper that we'll write, in that reflection, we found that that's where the learning really is, in all that reflection, in that detailed discussion we had about structures, methods, and outcomes. And so maybe if you're going to start to do this, maybe you need to start doing some reflection on it as well, and possibly talking with somebody else and sharing your ideas and starting to bounce it off somebody else to come up with some brilliant, more and better ideas. But what I'm thinking, and I'm bouncing this idea off Kath, and we're starting to look at another move further down the track here, is that the future engagement may well lie in gamification of both learning and of the application of skills. So, for example, we're in the process of starting to look at developing a database development game so that the assignments would actually be built into the game. In order to go up a level and level up, you'd have to achieve certain things. Then you could level up, and then if you do have to achieve certain other things in order to level up further. And so they could actually, those assignments and assessments could be related to that leveling up through different parts of the game. So that's an area we're starting to think about and play with. There's a bit of work to be done on it yet before we get into the true development, but it's an area we think might have some really, really interesting applications. So that's what I've got. If you want to find out more about Mulligans or online quizzes or the way to approach it, come and either talk to me or to Kath and ask us, and let's see where we can take it. Okay. Thank you very much for listening.